The reason Wrexham works is there's a lot of reason it works, but it really works because Ryan Reynolds is behind it and he has a massive social media following and he's brilliant on the marketing side. It's just very much a reactive thinking where it's like we buy a football club and we put a bunch of money into it and we hope we win games, we hope we get promoted, and there's really no philosophy or strategy, right, in or outside the pitch. In a respectful and incremental way, make changes, right? Figure out how we can control for costs, and whether that's in the structures of profit and sustainability or financial fair play. How do we slowly, incrementally grow revenues and invest in infrastructure?
Welcome to the Football Economy, the show where we explore the business and strategy behind the beautiful game. I'm Ibrahim. Today's guest is Jordan Gardner, a standout figure in football leadership. As an American sports executive with real success in European football, Jordan brings a unique perspective in terms of practical applications in the global game. He was chairman and CEO of FC Helsingør in Denmark from 2019 to 2022, leading to the club to promotion and consistent top four finishes. He's also held stakes in Dundalk FC and Swansea City, and now advises both 21st Group and Shamrock Capital in different capacities. So from raising capital to turning around global operations in terms of specific clubs, Jordan has done it all. He's also shares his insights when it comes to football leadership in FIFA, in terms of the FIFA diploma, and also his the ECA management courses. Jordan, it's great to have you on.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Perfect. So let's start with your journey. I know you've done a few podcasts where basically you expressed how you got into European football, but let's talk about your early roots of being a football fan, of playing soccer. Yourself as an under 18, would you be amazed or would you be sort of like sure that this is the right path you'd have taken where you are right now?
I think I would definitely be very surprised with the path I took. You know, I played soccer through high school, through youth soccer, then semi-professionally, but I don't think there was any point up until much more recently in the last 10 years that I thought that making a career of this or being on the business side, certainly not just in the sport, but globally, you know, everything that I did in the soccer space when I was a child was here in the US. And so, yeah, I think it's been a crazy journey for me. One thing's led to another. Yeah, I'm just obviously very grateful that I have the opportunity to work in this space and something I'm really passionate about. And yeah.
No, yeah, the passion comes through from your sort of impressive pedigree and the things you've done in industry. But let's look at your time in Wales, Ireland, and Denmark. What comes across to you when you look back at this sort of like journey you've had in terms of like the consistent themes that come across from your time there, trying to obviously improve the operations of those clubs?
So each experience was very different, right? In Wales, I was just a passive minority investor. In Ireland, I was a board member. And then in Denmark, I was chief executive and chairman. So definitely very obviously different size clubs, different projects, different strategies, and certainly from my perspective, different operational controls. Some of these investments and projects I've been a part of in the past, I've been passive and been able to kind of observe and learn. Others I've had actually decision-making power, such as our most recent project. I think the biggest theme is just how the industry, and it's not to pick on these clubs that I was particularly involved with, but it's very slow to change. It's very slow to professionalize. I think there's very much a way of looking at running a European football club, and there's a strong resistance to change and modernize. And I think, myself coming from a strong financial background, I look at the way a lot of these clubs run and the way they're commercialized and the certainly the amount of money that's spent and the financial structures. And it doesn't make a lot of sense, a lot of these clubs. So I think for me, a lot of what I spend a lot of time on, and I have spent a lot of time on, is how do we, in a respectful and incremental way, make changes, right? How do we figure out how we can control for costs, and whether that's in the structures of profit and sustainability or financial fair play? How do we slowly, incrementally grow revenues and invest in infrastructure? And obviously, most importantly, how do we build structures in place on the footballing side that we can have success on the pitch, which we certainly had in varying degrees in the various projects. And a lot of that is really down to bringing in good people, having good operators, having good footballing people, whether that's the manager, whether that's the sporting director, having good processes in place from an ownership and a leadership perspective to empower those folks to do their job. I mean, the best clubs in the world you see have, really kind of ownership that takes a step back and lets the people that they brought into place do their job, and they hire good people and they have good strategy. You look at Brighton and Brentford and some of these clubs, particularly from a financial perspective, that do quite well. They have really good cohesive strategy. So that's something I think I've learned over the course of my time in European football, that to have a successful club, you really need to have cohesive strategy, stability, and really good people to execute that vision for you.
You've mentioned strategy a few times, I'm going to double click on that. So let's reflect back to in your time in Helsingør. I hope I'm not butchering that, by the way. And
You got it right.
you're the CEO and you're the chairman there, if I'm not mistaken, chairman of the board. What would the first 30, 60, 90 days like in that position? And looking back, what were the things you feel like you could have done or incrementally improved better or move faster in that sense?
So we kind of inherited a really difficult situation where we bought the club right as it was getting relegated from the Danish first division to the Danish second division. So anyone who's gone through a relegation understands that that creates a lot of turmoil within the organization. You have players that maybe don't want to be there anymore. You have massive decreases in revenue. You have a lot of your staff is worried if they're going to lose their jobs. So there was a lot of instability at the club on one hand. On the other hand, we inherited a club that was not professionalized. It was basically being run by an association or a not-for-profit organization. So there was a lot of work to be done to kind of change the culture in and around the club. I went to training one of the first weeks I was there in Denmark, and you could just tell that the players didn't want to be there. The staff, no one wanted to be there. There was just a really like kind of a toxic culture at the club. And so for us, the priority was change and change quickly. And frankly, in retrospect, to answer your question, I wish I had made some changes quicker. There were some changes I made at the executive level of the club that maybe I waited a little bit too long. I waited more 3, 4, 5 months rather than making those changes decisively right after we bought the club. So for me, that was really bringing in a strong management team that could change the culture, and then obviously bringing in lots of new players, changing our organizational philosophy, changing our relationship and the way the club looked at spending and cost controls. And, I think that for us, it took some time. We went down to the Danish second division, and definitely it took some time to rebuild. But fortunately enough, we were able to get the club promoted, and then really build that momentum into future seasons and back in the higher divisions of Danish football. And so, for us, I was fortunate enough that we crafted and created an environment where we had stability in places that most football clubs don't. My number two from a commercial perspective, my COO, my manager, my sporting director, were all there basically almost the entire time we were in Denmark. So almost 4 years, we had the same management team in place. And that is very unique in European football. We had a pretty stable roster for the most part, outside of, 2 or 3 players every transfer window kind of coming and going or getting sold. So that stability was really a key for us. And I think the learning curve for me, or the advice I give other groups when they're asking how to go through this process, is really, obviously quickly and decisively evaluating the assets and the structure of the current organization, making the change, and then understanding that's going to take some time for change to really sink in and culture to build. And obviously this is sport. As a club starts to go from a club that loses a lot of games to winning a lot of games, culture organically starts to change both on and off the pitch. And so that's something that, I certainly spent a lot of time working on.
And if I'm not mistaken, there's a key term you mentioned, the organizational philosophy. So looking back now, I mean, well, not even looking back, looking forward, what is that organizational philosophy? Could you basically break it down for us in terms of how you come into a club, what sort of like operational levers you look at, what sort of like quick wins, and how do you lay that in the open for the people or key stakeholders you're working with?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the challenge that a lot of football clubs is they don't have that, what you describe, organizational structure or strategy. It's just very much a reactive thinking where it's like we buy a football club and we put a bunch of money into it and we hope we win games, we hope we get promoted, and there's really no philosophy or strategy, right, in or outside the pitch. And again, that varies by the club. I think using Brighton and Brentford, for example, they have a very clear and cohesive strategy when it comes to the use of data and how they're going to, basically on and off the pitch hit well above their weight in terms of the size of their club and the amount of money they spend. For us in Denmark, for me, it was kind of twofold. It was an organizational strategy off the pitch and then on the pitch. Off the pitch, our organizational strategy was very much like, how do we take the philosophy that I just mentioned? How do we hit above our weight? Because we're not here to just burn cash. We're not going to outspend anyone. We're not the biggest club in Denmark. So how do we make better and more efficient decisions when it comes to spending? And that took obviously a lot of discipline from the top on down, from myself on down to our management team. It took a good cohesive strategy in terms of understanding what our relationships were with the whole stakeholders, whether it was our academy, whether it was agents, whether it was our scouting infrastructure. And so that kind of blended into our footballing strategy, which is how are we going to give ourselves a competitive advantage over other clubs that maybe were spending more money than us? And I think at first we thought maybe that was bringing in players from abroad, like bringing in players from America. Denmark generally doesn't have very many difficulties in bringing in foreign players. But as we kind of tested that thesis out and then COVID hit, we realized that that wasn't a strategy that was really going to work for us. And so we took some time to evaluate over time, over a period of years, what other Danish clubs that had success from coming from the lower divisions and getting promoted. And we consistently found that the clubs that had success had a core of their roster that was domestic talent. And when I say domestic, I mean obviously Danish, but Norwegian and Swedish as well. And so for us, we decided that our philosophy, our organizational structure was going to be we're going to be the best club of our size in Denmark at recruiting domestic players. And so we spent infrastructure and time and energy on scouting the lower divisions of Denmark, scouting the academies of the biggest clubs in Denmark, and really just focused a core on bringing in Danish players who knew the keys to success in Danish football. And then we also had a competitive advantage where our pitch was artificial, an artificial surface where most of the pitches in Denmark weren't. And so that gave us a bit of an advantage where other clubs would have difficulty when they'd come to play for us. We were able to play very much a possession-based style, and we recruited players for that style. So it gave us an advantage. And so I think all of those things kind of came together cohesively for us to build a strategy where we're all kind of going in the same direction. We're not just signing players through the door that some agent tells us about. We're signing players that fit our cohesive philosophy and strategy. We're signing players from a philosophical level who want to be there, who aren't signing just because we can give them the most money, because we obviously can't. And then once we have success, we're building on the narrative that we're going to help these players move on and move their careers to bigger clubs so we can prove to them that, hey, you know what, you can go to this other club and make twice as much money, but that's not going to be great for your career. Or you can come to us and produce and have a lot of success and be in a great environment, and we can sell you to a bigger club. We can sell you to Spain, France, Italy, and this can advance your career and kind of rinse and repeat. So it was a version of all of the things I described is the way we put that structure into place in Denmark. Obviously, for another club in another country, it could be very different. But if I'm talking to an owner of a championship club in England and they're saying, hey, I want to craft a strategy, what does that look like? The question you just have to ask yourself is, what does that look like in comparison to all the other clubs? Because everyone's doing the same thing. You have some cost controls in place. Some clubs are spending more money than others, but every club has basically the same amount, the same academy. Every club has the same, they're all very similar. So whether it's a footballing philosophy, whether it's a data infrastructure that other clubs don't have, whether it's a recruitment strategy, whether it's a human capital where you're just bringing in really smart people that other clubs don't have, you need that competitive advantage of a football club. Otherwise, you're just doing the same as everyone else is, and that's not necessarily going to lead to success for the most part.
No, it's what you said is very practical and obviously very insightful in terms of how clubs should be differentiating themselves and basically using competitive advantage as a catalyst to be sustainable going forward and have a very strong foundation. But then what I would say to that is strategy without measurement, doesn't really work as well. How are you measuring these strategies? Like, what are you benching them against? Like, what are the key KPIs the metrics you're trying to look at to make sure that your strategy or your tactics that come from the strategy are actually moving you forward and hitting the needle?
I mean, I think the good news in sport, right? You see the results on the pitch. You win games, your strategy, at least in some form, is working, right? I think as we started to see our players being monetized in a way where we could sell them for significantly higher amounts than we could before, we start to see that the strategy was working. Again, I go back to a lot of it, certainly from a footballing strategy perspective, is reliant on your strategy is working if you're winning games, if you're getting your clubs promoted. That's a pretty key indicator. Obviously, off the pitch, the KPIs are very much like, what does my financial performance look like? Have I reduced my losses? Am I cash flow positive? How does my financial performance look versus my other competitors? So a key KPI for me after we had kind of really righted the ship on our club and we're back in the Danish first division was, I think the first season there, we finished in fourth place out of 12 teams in the table, but our wage bill was, I think, ninth or 10th, on the table. So you look at that and you say, what we're doing is working. We're hitting above our weight. We're not wasting. We're spending wisely, and we have a good cohesive strategy. Like, we're having success on the pitch and we're having success off the pitch. Now, again, were we making money necessarily at that point? Probably not for that season. But what are the realistic KPIs? How does that happen over time? I think those are pretty clear to football club in terms of yes, that's working. No, that's not working.
Mm. Okay, well, that's well understood. And in terms of just to go deeper into this, what are the sort of like the key strategies around risk management? So how you mitigating against risks in terms of being the operator and being the chairman and the CEO of that football club. And I'm not if I'm not mistaken, you're obviously taking an investment in the club itself. So you have skin in the game in that sense. So what are the risk mitigators in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's inherent risk in sport, right? There's many variables out of my control that I could do everything right and a club could still lose games, could still get relegated. Players could get injured. We had an interesting situation in Denmark where we were on in our second season of the Danish First Division. We were in first place the whole season, and we had one of our best players, 25 years old, decide to retire middle of the season for personal reasons. So how do you mitigate that risk? How do you plan for that? You really can't, right? So the way I look at risk management is, when we're making decisions as a football club, that could be creating a budget, that could be bringing in staff, that could be more importantly to signing players, building our roster. I want to have a diversity of viewpoints in our executive team to make sure that we're making good decisions, right? I think the sports organizations, and it's not just European football, that run into trouble. It's where one person is kind of the king of the ship and they're making all their decisions. And maybe if they're really smart, they can get lucky, but they very much live in a silo. And I think that's what you run into when you have clubs, let's say North America, that are run by an owner who has a lot of money, who thinks they're super smart and they make all the decisions. For me and for us, at least for our project in Denmark, it was important that, we're coming in as Americans into European football with a different perspective. While I did play semi-professionally, I have never played at a level of this high. I'm not in any position to come in and identify talent or decide who we should sign. So I think it was important for us as an executive team. We had two Americans, myself and my number two on the commercial side. We had two Danes on the football side, my manager and my sporting director. And when we're making decisions, we're kind of coming together. There's a diversity of viewpoints, both from a footballing and non-footballing perspective, and both from a North American versus European perspective to help understand, is this the right decision? What are the things we're not thinking about? How does this fit into our cohesive strategy? And ultimately, as the chairman and CEO, I have to make the decision. But I think oftentimes, first off, we were aligned probably 90% of the time, which helps, right? But more often than not, you're not going to make every decision right. It helped us de-risk certain decisions. So if our sporting director came to us with a player that they really liked, and we kind of had a more cohesive conversation, and after talking for a while, we realized that that player didn't necessarily fit our system, or maybe there were red flags off the pitch, we would decide not to sign that player. And we didn't make every decision right. We learned over a period of time. Certainly I learned as the chairman, when we would make mistakes, but having a lot of different people in the room giving me different viewpoints helped, I think, de-risk a lot of the decision making as a football club. And I think that is something that a lot of football clubs run into, challenges where they make very rash decisions or decisions driven by one person at the top. And that can be difficult, at least in my opinion.
So less autocratic decision making and more, well, maybe decision by committee or by,
I mean,
by
look,
the actual
at the
team.
end of the day, you can't be paralyzed, right? As a football club, someone has to make the decisions. In that case, that was me. But being able to be open and with diversity of viewpoints to help me form my decisions, I think was really important. And again, that's where I think other clubs at times have trouble.
Okay, that's well understood. And but looking at the sort of like your entry into Denmark, at that time, if I'm not mistaken, there was less foreign capital injected into the system there. And just looking back now, obviously the landscape has changed. It's evolved naturally as everything in life does. Where do you see the untapped opportunities now? Just looking at the football landscape.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. When we went into Denmark, this was 2018, 2019. There wasn't a lot of foreign ownership groups there. That was one of the reasons that it attracted us. I think now you could argue among many other markets, as much as I really do like Danish football, and I think it's a really good, smart place for people to invest if they're going to invest in European football. It is a bit oversaturated. I think that, Western Europe, it's become very saturated with foreign investment. There aren't as many opportunities from a deal sourcing perspective of clubs that are attractive, that makes sense. I think you could look at England, which is one of the areas on the consulting side I spend a lot of time on, and there's lots and lots of foreign ownership groups. And again, like we talked about earlier, a lot of them are trying to do the same thing. So for me, where are the opportunities? I think the two places that I see more opportunity in the long run are emerging markets from a football perspective, whether that's South America, whether that's Asia. I've done a couple deals and worked on some projects in Australia. Some of these markets that are a little bit less untapped, a little less competitive from a foreign capital perspective, much more upside maybe in the long run. So that's one area where I think there's opportunity. I think the other opportunity is on the women's side. I think women's football is really untapped, particularly in Europe. I think we're just starting to see more sophisticated capital coming into the women's side. Obviously, that there's a challenge there where many of the women's clubs in Europe are obviously attached to men's products. I think there's opportunity for joint ventures for clubs that don't necessarily have the time or energy or desire to invest in their women's product to spin off their women's side to entities and whether that's private equity or venture capital groups or high net worth individuals who see the opportunity on the women's side. So those are the two areas I see the most opportunity. That doesn't mean that there aren't still clubs that pop up that are, folks that are being opportunistic, that are undervalued or distressed for whatever reason. But just the idea of we're just going to buy a club in X country in Europe because it's undervalued and it can make us a lot of money. Like you don't see that very often anymore. It's a somewhat difficult environment to find good deals.
No, it's true. I mean, you mentioned Michelle Kang and women's football, but we can go into that later on in the discussion. What I want to ask now is around multi-club ownership, the model that Michelle Kang has also used. It's obviously prevalent in the men's game. City Football Group does that. Red Bull does that. But obviously, it is currently succeeding as a trend. In your advisory work, where do you see the most well-run multi-groups that are currently finding sort of like headwinds in that sense?
I think, City Football Group and Red Bull have proven the model and proven that you can have a successful multi-club structure. Obviously, there's caveats there. City Football Group aren't necessarily doing it to make money. They're doing it for other geopolitical reasons. Red Bull, they're doing it, backed by a marketing company. I haven't seen too many groups that are just doing it for the football necessarily have quite success yet. I think a lot of the groups, the first conversation I have with a lot of groups that are interested in multi-club is, have you or are you running one football club well, efficiently, successfully? Because obviously a multi-club structure amplifies that over three, four, five, six different clubs and makes things just much more logistically challenging. And it takes a lot of time, energy, and particularly capital to build the structures to oversee that. And I think that's what people don't necessarily realize about City Football Group, for instance, is there's a massive holding company that sits above all the football clubs with hundreds of employees and lots of money invested that manages that. And I think some of the multi-club groups out there have struggled a bit where they don't necessarily have the infrastructure. The clubs don't talk to each other. They're not really interacting, or players aren't moving, and you're not really realizing economies of scale. And that kind of defeats the purpose of a multi-club structure. On a piece of paper, multi-club as a strategy makes a ton of sense, particularly the idea of can we control the supply chain when it comes to developing talent? If I'm Chelsea and I'm spending 50 million euros on a player out of Brazil, why would I not just buy a club in Brazil and control the talent pipeline? Conceptually, that makes a lot of sense. But in reality, it's quite difficult to buy a club in Brazil. You have to have people that can identify and develop the talent in Brazil and move that over to Chelsea and all whatnot. So, I think there are groups that are having success. Some groups are getting more creative where it's not just we have 5 men's football clubs. Maybe they're investing in different assets, and 49ers Enterprises now has an NFL team and has Leeds and has maybe Rangers. You have groups that are investing in other businesses that are adjacent to the football club. So sports technology companies. So I think we're starting to get to a point where people are getting a little bit more creative because at the end of the day, football clubs by themselves aren't particularly profitable ventures. Let's just be real. Most of them are not profitable. Most of them are loss making. And so the idea of I own one loss making business, now I'm going to multiply that by 5 is not a great business, right? So that being said, there are opportunities, as I've talked about ad nauseum in other forums, about bringing these clubs together, giving yourself a competitive advantage, monetizing the development of players in a way that is attractive. But it's a really difficult model, really difficult. And for me, the groups that have success build slowly and organically, saying, okay, we've done one club, we've done that well, now we'll add a second, and I'll kind of be a feeder club, and maybe over a period of time, we'll add a third or a fourth. And we're doing it for very specific reasons. We're going to markets where we think we can control the pipeline when it comes to talent, or we have other existing businesses in that country that gives us an advantage or whatnot. We're not just buying clubs to buy clubs, because there is, for some groups, a vanity component of, hey, I get to own a club in Italy and Greece and France and Spain, and it's fun. And I can go, on my holiday and go visit my different clubs. And like, that's great. You can do that, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense strategically from a business perspective.
Yeah, that's true. So I completely agree with you. It's all about the end goal. What's the North Star? What's the decision? What's the reason behind the decision as opposed to jumping on a trend that seems that might work for you, and also making sure that it's personalized to the actual potential group or parent company. But let's look at your operational capacity in commercial specialists when it comes to being a commercial specialist at 24 group, 24 21st group. Not necessarily speaking about the intricacies of the role itself, but looking at it from an outside perspective, where do you see the opportunities for using analytics to supercharge sort of like revenue generation, sponsorship, but also when it comes to media rights in football? So in that sense.
I think most clubs, when they look at the use of data analytics, it's obviously is more on the football side, right? It's how do we create algorithms and give ourselves a data-driven competitive advantage on the football side. Obviously, I think the biggest clubs in the world are trying to figure out how do we get more fans to our matches, how do we maximize revenue. The challenge with that is there's obviously sensitivities in the sport. I've talked also on other platforms about ticket pricing and how it can be really difficult to maximize ticket pricing in a European sporting environment where there's strong cultural pushback against that. So there is a lot of sensitivities around that. I think the groups that I see that have the most success are the ones that are investing in infrastructure and then can kind of overlay a data-driven approach to that. So take Tottenham, right? They have a new stadium. They're opening, it's been open for a while now, but how do we figure out how we maximize hospitality, sponsorship? How do we use data to get new demographics of supporters into our stadium? So there's a lot of work in those areas, but most clubs, frankly, they don't spend a lot of time, on data-driven strategy when it comes to commercial. I think many clubs, unfortunately, take an approach where if I'm a Premier League club and I'm getting 100 or 150 million pounds in media rights distributions, what is another two, three, four, 500K in sponsorship or ticketing or game day revenue really going to change? That's not really going to matter. What's going to matter is that I do better on the pitch and have better performance on the pitch, and that'll drive my revenue, which is partly true. So there's this a bit of a change and a bit of a learning and educating process for a lot of groups that like you need to spend time and energy on commercial. It's important. You need to find the right levers to grow commercial. And I think, if you go to a European football game, depending on the market of the country, like the demographics can be quite stale, older, male. How do we reach younger demographics? How do we reach women? How do we reach people of certain minorities? Like, how do we bring new supporters into the ecosystem? And there are creative ways to do that, but I don't see that many clubs spending energy on that. So maybe that is certainly something, the wave of the future, more American investment, more sophisticated investment coming in, looking at that. But to answer your question from a data-driven approach, it's almost exclusively from what I see on the football side, not on the commercial side.
It's completely true. I mean, I see that also in the work we try to do. Basically, football clubs are heavily reliant, well, not just heavily reliant, it's more of like they go back to default, which is relying on broadcasting deals and solidarity payments from the Premier League, if that's but speaking about the English league specifically. But yeah, it requires an injection of ideas regardless of capital. But now we speak about American football, American influx of capital and operational know-how into the European football industry. What's your take or opinion on the European Super League debacle, which, I mean, you'd be the first to admit that it showed the tension between American way of doing things and European sort of like traditions. What was your take on that, and where do you see the future of that taking shape in a different format?
I mean, obviously, conceptually, it was a disaster. It was not well thought out. The launch was quite poor. My take on this idea, which I think obviously at this point is dead. I think it was the launch was so poor. I don't foresee any future version of this idea coming to fruition. My thought is the Champions League right now in its structure is basically a super league for all intents and purposes. I think more teams, more revenue will go into that competition in coming years, and the Champions League will continue to try to peel off market share from the domestic leagues to the extent that it can. And so, look, I think you're always going to have certainly American-driven new ideas on how to modernize the industry. I don't necessarily think the Super League conceptually idea was a horrible idea. It just wasn't done again in a way, putting aside the launch and the way it was rolled out, which was awful and it was never going to work. But conceptually, the idea of how do we have more meaningful matches? How do we get the top clubs playing each other in an environment where people are more interested? That makes sense. But, again, European football, the whole sport is driven by domestic competitions. Like without that Tuesday night game between Southampton and Leicester, the Premier League can't exist. Sure, the top clubs in the Premier League, most of the revenue is certainly driven by interest in those clubs. But these leagues are bigger than just the top 3 to 4 clubs. And the idea of just peeling off those clubs into a different competition, like it was never going to fly. So it's like, how do we continue to strengthen domestic competitions and continue to have these stories of smaller clubs in these smaller markets that really excite people, whether it's a Wrexham or whatnot, in addition to having the best teams play each other and growing the revenue and growing the interest in the sport. And I think to me, again, like I said, I think that is growing the Champions League. We'll continue to see that kind of tension, I think, between the Champions League and domestic competitions. I can see a point in the future where there's just more games in the Champions League and, maybe more midweek game, not just midweek games, maybe more games on the weekend that are kind of starting to go head to head with domestic competitions. I can see some tension there in the future, but in terms of another launch of another full-fledged, outlier competition like this, it's just not going to happen.
Okay, fair point. So let's take it into a more conceptual area. So let's say you're the newly appointed CEO of, let's say, Bolton Wanderers, and you're being tasked with moving them up the ladder of the football pyramid. What is the strategy that you take and put in place in terms of making sure that that comes into fruition?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is kind of doing almost like an evaluation of what is working at the club and what isn't working at the club. And then, like I said earlier, kind of starting to make quick strategic changes to the organization that are needed. I think probably the number one thing I would do is just look at the cost basis. How much money are we spending? Why are we losing so much money? What areas do we need to control for costs? What do we have the right people in key positions? Do we have the right cohesive long-term strategy? What is our time horizon for, I don't know, what league I think Bolton's in League One right now. So, what is our strategy to get back to the championship? Is it even realistic to have a conversation about that club getting back to the Premier League? If so, what is the time horizon? To your point earlier, what is our risk tolerance in terms of the amount of capital we're outlaying? Because in that example, in League One, for instance, you have a mix of clubs that are trying to be somewhat financially sustainable towards the bottom, and then clubs towards the top, which are just chasing promotion, chasing the dream of the Premier League. The problem with option number 2 is that those clubs are losing a lot of money. So, part of it is sitting back with an investment group and saying, what is our strategy? Maybe we have a long-term cohesive strategy of get to the Premier League. We have a significant amount of growth capital allocated to do that. And we're going to invest, and we're going to try to get promoted. Whereas you could have an ownership group that's like, look, we're not interested in burning tons of cash. We want just sustainability. If we can get promoted, great, but we want to be sustainable, in which case that's a completely different approach. So it kind of depends on the philosophy of the ownership group. But for me, it's really about like, how do we stabilize the club, assuming it's distressed. I don't know if this club's distressed or not, but figuring out what's working and what's not working, and then starting to plan 6, 12, 18 months into the future.
Yeah, it's a sound strategy. Just to double click on that. So now you have a commercial lens, and then now Bolton is, for all intent purposes, they're stable. What is the commercial strategy for Bolton to obviously supercharge your revenue?
Yeah. So it's like, how many season tickets are we selling? Is there unsold inventory? What is our ticket pricing? And obviously that's a separate discussion about what we can and can't do there. What does our sponsorship database look like? Are there companies out there that we're not hitting? Are there companies out there locally that maybe were with us when we were in the Premier League 15 years ago that left that we can re-engage with? Do we own our stadium? Are there opportunities for non-footballing revenue generation in the stadium, whether that's hospitality, whether that's meetings, events, concerts, whatnot? Are those other opportunities there? I'm not a proponent of kind of, we're going to replicate Wrexham and we're going to do a documentary like a lot of people talk about, because I don't think that's replicable. And I think that's just a waste of time. But are there other creative ways that we can bring in new revenues specific to that club? Maybe some football clubs own real estate. So maybe there's a way to monetize that. Those are probably all the things I would probably be thinking about. Again, football clubs are not particularly complicated businesses. There's not magical revenue coming out that you haven't thought of. Like, it's tickets, it's sponsorship, it's hospitality, it's game day. Like, there, obviously that you can't create revenue out of thin air. So it's about how do we figure out and focus in on the core revenue and figure out where the growth is there. And if there is no growth, maybe they're doing a great job. Maybe the stadium's sold out every week and they're doing a great job. Then to me, it immediately transitions to cost control. Like, we're spending too much money. So that's a lever we can pull. There's only so many levers you can pull here, right? And if you can't grow commercial, you really need to figure out what the cost looks like on the other side.
Okay. And just to reflect on the comment you made there, where you said the Wrexham model is not replicable, it's not replicable in other football clubs. First of all, why do you say that? And second of all, do you not see a value in sort of like content generation, not specifically in the documentary series format, but in other sort of like formats?
Yeah, I mean, I think every football club generating content, whether it's media or social media, is important. I mean, the question is above and beyond just engaging with your current fan base, how is that going to help you grow your football club or grow your revenue? I see a lot of football clubs, even large football clubs, come in and say, hey, we're X club and we're going to become a global brand, right? Can Bolton Wanderers ever become a global brand? The answer is extremely unlikely, right? It's a club like there's a million other clubs in England. They're not in the Premier League. Even if they were in the Premier League, like how is that actually going to happen? The reason Wrexham works is there's a lot of reason it works, but it really works because Ryan Reynolds is behind it and he has a massive social media following and he's brilliant on the marketing side. And they've spent a lot of time and energy on the ground actually investing in the football club and spending their time. And, you know, they were first movers really in this authentic media engagement space. Sure, you had kind of behind the scenes locker room style documentaries out there, but this was different. This was like we're showing you from the top down what it looks like to really build a football club and the idea of getting a club promoted and getting a club promoted multiple times. No one had really shown that story yet from a media perspective. And I think anyone else trying to do it is just going to tell the same story, which is not a new and unique story. So unless you have something new to tell, a new story to tell, and an audience the size of, Ryan Reynolds' global social media presence, I personally don't believe you're going to have a lot of success. I think it's very easy for folks in this industry to just kind of copycat and assume what works for other groups is going to work for me. But Wrexham is an entirely unique situation, unique project driven by a very, very, very savvy marketing team and driven by a global Hollywood superstar. So if me or you or anyone on the street tried that, like no one is going to care, unfortunately. That's not to say you shouldn't be producing content. You should try to find ways. Look, if I'm Bolton Wanderers and I, for whatever reason, sign a player from Thailand who's just this kick-ass player who has like a 10 million social media following in Thailand, maybe I start producing content in and around engaging fans in Thailand and sponsors in Thailand, like very targeted. That kind of stuff can work. But the idea of a Wrexham style documentary for any club other than Wrexham is, in my opinion, just a waste of time, personally.
Okay. So in terms of there's an open league, there's a closed league system comparing American football to or American soccer to European football. What's your opinion on potentially revising the sort of like the non aspects of promotion relegation in the American system in MLS, for instance? Like in terms of when it does mature and be respectable, in terms of like having the ability to develop its own world star players, having the ability to actually attract players at their prime as opposed to when they're declining in that sense. Do you see opportunities or in sort of like a point where the MLS decides, you know what, we actually need to go towards the Jeopardy model, which is what European football has in terms of having promotion relegation, or do you see it as a non-starter in that sense?
It's a non-starter. It's never going to happen in North America. Certainly not with MLS. The second division USL is trying to create their own system of promotion relegation, but that isn't going to be meaningful in any way when it's not connected to MLS. The challenge you have is that you have an ecosystem in MLS and you have owners who spent a lot of money and bought into a closed system, right? If I was an owner and I just spent hundreds of millions of dollars on a football club and I bought into a system where I didn't have to have relegation risk, right, which decreases the value of my investment, why would I agree to that investment? Like, why would I agree to that risk? You would never agree to that. It just wouldn't happen. Obviously, I completely understand and sympathize with the argument that a promotion relegation system creates more jeopardy and makes maybe the larger ecosystem healthier and could potentially grow revenues for the club, although it's hard to quantify that. I just unfortunately don't think with the way professional soccer was set up from the beginning in the US that we're ever going to see a promotion relegation system. I think that's just something that's just not going to happen, unfortunately. It's a different system. Look, other markets, not a lot, but other markets, Australia, they have closed systems. And from a pure financial perspective, it makes sense. You can have cost controls. You don't have to worry about relegation risk jeopardy. There's a reason when you look at the like global football club valuations that MLS clubs are like 20 of them are in the top 40 of the valuations, even though their revenues are a fraction of most clubs, is because you can, when you have certainty, when you don't have the amount of risk that you have related to not just relegation in European football, but if you're a big club, maybe you have risk where if you don't make European competition every year, that's a massive loss of revenue for you. There's a lot of other risk factors there. Or you're a massive player selling club, and for whatever reason you don't have that one year. In In MLS, you don't have to worry about a lot of those things. You really can just kind of focus in on the business perspective and see the asset grow. And so I understand why it's like that, and it increases the valuations of the clubs. I think on the flip side, does it hinder the growth of the sport? Does it hinder the opportunity for better and younger players to play in the league? Yeah, maybe you could make that argument. But at the end of the day, football, certainly in the US, is an investment, and investors want to see a return and want to see their asset valuations grow. And promotion relegation is a system that will never be in line with that philosophy, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, it's true. Like, certainty is key to investment, and investors would detest a situation where there's uncertainty. We see that in the geopolitical realm right now and the macro trends. But I mean, you've exited football investments in different capacities. What would your advice be to a potential investor in a football club? I'm sorry, potential American investor in a football club in that sense. What would be the key advice you'd be giving them in terms of how they should position themselves to make sure that they are in a position to actually exit at an ROI that is beneficial to them and their fund or the family offices in that case?
I mean, I think a lot of it is going in with realistic expectations of investing in this asset class. I think there's some folks that come in that don't understand the difficulties of being a profitable or successful, building a profitable or successful financial model at a football club. I think they come from maybe success in other industries. Maybe they've had success in North American sport. As we've talked about, the structures in place in North America are very different. The risk factors are much higher. So it's about understanding what's a realistic time horizon. Maybe if I'm talking to a private equity group and generally their time horizons on investments are 8 to 10 years and they're looking for 10 to 15x return on investment, that's not realistic in football. There's no investment in European football. You're going to get that. So you have to say, all right, like maybe we have to change a bit of our time horizon. Maybe our ROI, return on investment on exit, is only going to be 3 to 5x. That's more realistic, right? Because if you don't take that approach, you're going to be very disappointed because this is not a normal business. It just isn't. And if you don't understand that it is a different asset class, you shouldn't do this, right? If an investor came to me and said, I need that 10x return on my investment or else can't justify this investment, I would say, don't make this investment, not in this asset class, right? So I think it's a lot about being realistic. Obviously, everything we've talked about earlier, once you own the asset, is really important to build a good, stable, sustainable business because no one wants to buy a business that's failing or losing money or distressed. And then being patient and letting that grow with the right people in place. And then over time, it's saying, okay, it's 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever the time horizon is. Now we're ready to exit. And now we're going to go through a cohesive, patient process with an investment bank and we're going to put it out to market. A lot of football clubs run out of money or for whatever reason they're distressed and then they can't maximize their exit price, obviously, because they're distressed, right? And from a buyer perspective, that's great. So from a seller perspective, it's like, okay, maybe we have to exit, maybe we don't, but let's hire an investment bank. Let's take the time. Let's make sure we bring in the right buyer with the right credibility and the right price point, being patient. I think all those things kind of come into play to have a successful exit.
Yeah, that's well said. So yeah, I mean, you've been in Europe for a while in terms of having like roots here, like having like physical roots here, being here present. I think in Denmark you spent 4 years, if I'm not
Yep.
mistaken.
Yep. 4 years.
What was like the cultural adaptation for you? Like what challenged you the most from a working capacity or perspective, but also from a personal perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very different environment in Europe. Obviously, it depends on the country. Some of the projects I work on, Spain, Italy, France, language can be a really big challenging and a big adjustment. Luckily for us in Denmark, and one of the reasons I picked Denmark is that, most folks speak English, so that made it a little bit easier. But, you know, there's a very different philosophy, not just in the footballing ecosystem in these places, but in the cultural ecosystem, right? A lot of these countries, let's say in Scandinavia, have a very socialist mindset, which is very different from the way we look at things in the US. And it's not right or wrong, it's just different. So the way people look at the work culture, the labor laws, the tax laws, like what I think a lot of people don't realize when they invest in football clubs is like you're buying a business in a foreign country. I know a lot of Europeans don't like me using the word business when it comes to a football club, but you're paying taxes, you're supporting the local communities. Like it is a business. You're running a business. Most of the stuff that I did on a day-to-day basis in Denmark was not fun. It was not sexy. It was not, taking the players out to dinner and hanging out with agents. It was dealing with our payroll and our P&L and dealing with our business license and the Danish Business Authority. So, I think the biggest adjustment and what folks need to learn is like the business climate in that country. And that was a big adjustment for me for sure. It took some time. Denmark's a wonderful place and I really enjoyed spending my time in that country in particular, but it took definitely adjustment for me to understand and integrate a bit more culturally there rather than coming in as this kind of brash American. I'm going to say what I want and do what I want, which certainly some Americans do. But the ones that have success kind of really understand culturally how to integrate better. And it took me some time to figure that out. I like to think I did eventually, but it just takes time for sure.
Yeah, with everything in life, it takes time. Let's look at the academy sort of like unit within the football club. In my personal opinion, it's an underutilized asset. It just sits there. Nothing gets done with it. You know, in any other business, if you have underutilized assets, you fire the management or you look for other opportunities to improve it. So, in your opinion, what are the opportunities to actually, create a catalyst for the academy players to be a potential revenue generator as opposed to the tried and tested route of, pushing them to a first team or looking at selling them to a bigger club? What opportunities are there when you compare what goes on in the American market when it comes to commercialization of high school athletes or even college athletes? What can European football, the industry itself, learn from what the Americans do very well?
So one of the big differences between the kind of North American academy development, youth development style versus Europe is you have a pay to play model in a lot of places in North America where families and kids have to pay to participate. Now, obviously, if you're in a professionalized academy structure like an MLS academy, now you don't for the most part. But in Europe, that is very, very foreign in terms of asking kids to pay for youth development. And so that is difficult. It can be very difficult for a football club and a burden on a football club to spend significant resources on funding an academy when, whether that's a residency or whatnot, when, it's hard to know what the long-term return on your investment. I think the way I look at academies is a lot of the way I look at the football club as a whole is, do we have the right pieces in place in terms of coaches and strategy? Especially when you're developing young people, it's like, do we have the infrastructure in place? I remember hearing stories of a big club in Italy where they would bring in a whole bunch of academy kids from all different parts of the world, Africa, Asia, all not, and they were all kind of staying in the same dorm room, and no one spoke the same language, and there was no oversight, and that's the kind of environment where players will never develop, right? They're not going to develop into sellable assets or players that can help your first team. So for me, it's a little bit less about like, what are the pathways? Because there's no one right pathway for every player. You could potentially monetize a player out of your academy and just sell them because that's the right thing for you as a club or them as a player. They could come to your first team and stay with your first team for their whole career, or come to your first team and you sell them. Like, there's a lot of different pathways. It's really just about how do we build the right structures in place at the academy level to develop them? Because these are human beings, especially young children, human beings at the end of the day. And if we don't have the right structures in place, we're not going to get any sort of commercial or long-term benefit from that. And so, it also kind of goes back to like cohesive strategy. It's like, if I have a football club that has a great catchment area, then maybe it makes sense for my youth academy to be really focused on those players and bringing in those players. And so I have lots of structures in place to help develop those players. But maybe if I have connections in Africa or South America or Asia, it makes more sense for me to bring in foreign players, in which case I need to have staff that speaks the language, infrastructure that can help them integrate. The idea, I think a lot of folks in this ecosystem just assume players, whether they're first team or academy players, are just like robots. It's like, they're not. If you bring a player in from Africa, like, that's a, weather, language, culture, everything, like, it's totally different. So I think spending the time and the energy to make sure your environment at the academy level is right, and you're recruiting and bringing players in for the right environment, just like I say at the first team, is super important, because without that, you have no chance of monetizing or commercializing any of your players. Now, I don't think we're going to ever see in Europe an environment where it's this pay to play model like in North America, but I do think North America is probably well ahead of Europe in terms of infrastructure investment, facilities, fields, coaches, that kind of the amount of effort and energy that's put into actually developing the talent. I think a lot of European clubs and infrastructure there is quite lacking. There's just an assumption that, like, we're a big club, we're a great academy, all the good players that come to us and they're magically going to turn into great footballers. Maybe sometimes it happens, but it doesn't happen because of anything they're doing. It happens kind of by accident versus by design.
Yeah, no, it's true. So it's true, and that's why you see the successful academy players or academy structures come from the ones that have like actual deep investments, like the Uniteds, the Cities, the Madrids, the Barcelonas. But moving towards the women's game itself, I mean, there are lots of opportunities, as we all know, that women's game is at the startup level, so they're incurring a lot of costs. Naturally, this will happen to any business. What sort of like key sort of like lessons would you say should be applied to the women's game in terms of trying to develop the infrastructure, the players' welfare, and just every other parts and elements of the game that needs to be there to make sure that it's sustainable run and has a different pathway to growth to the way the men's game did. Would you apply from your time basically operating different football clubs? I know particularly specifically to the men's game, but I mean they are applicable to the women's game if it's personalized. What would that be for you?
The most important part, I think, is understanding that the women's game is not the men's game. Different, very different, different demographics. There's different concerns you have to deal with, whether it's player welfare or whatnot. Certainly from a supporter and commercial perspective, very different. I think a lot of clubs have taken the approach that like, oh, it's the same. It's just women, men, women, same thing. It's not. It's very different. So I think that's one thing to note is making sure that whether it's a marketing team, a commercial team, whether it's on the footballing side, you need to have people that understand the intricacies between the men's and women's game. Very, very important there. I think it's also important, and we're starting only to see this, and you mentioned Michelle King earlier, and I think she's done a really nice job of how does the relationship work between the men's and women's product when it's under the brand of a historically very successful men's team? So in her case, Lyon, right? She owns the Lyon's women's team. She also owns an independent club in London, London City Lionesses, which is a very different project where she can build her own brand and build that all from scratch. But with Lyon, it's attached to a men's team. So how do you figure out peel off the marketing perspective from that and figure out how do you build your own product that's attached to the Lyon's men's team? Same with Chelsea, same with Manchester United, all these clubs. So I think that's an interesting challenge. But I think one thing that people also just don't understand is like if you go to a Manchester United women's game versus a Manchester United men's game, there is very little, for the most part, overlap in the people that support and attend those matches. Very little overlap. It's a totally different demographic, which is great. As we talked about earlier, these clubs need to figure out how we're going to reach untapped demographics. And so I think it's a really good opportunity, if done the right way, to reach new fans and new sponsors and new people in the ecosystem, bring them within your club and figure out how do we engage with them. Maybe they only care about the women's team, which is great. Maybe they only care about the men's team. That's also great. But it just takes resources and energy and understanding. I don't think what you can do is kind of half-ass it and not spend the time and energy. You can't have your men's marketing team all of a sudden just overlap and do the women's team or men's social media. Like, especially at the bigger clubs, you need to have your own distinct investment and time and energy in the women's product and have your own strategy. Otherwise, I don't necessarily think you're going to have success. I think that's the challenge I've seen over the last 5 to 10 years in Europe is there hasn't been a lot of desire to spend time or energy on the women's side. It's kind of an afterthought. When if you want to do it properly, and we're now seeing the long-term benefits of that, you need to spend the time and energy to do that.
No, it's well said. And yeah, the like you mentioned earlier, to begin with, the women's game is an entirely different product in itself and requires a different lens. And probably a different lens comes from the women itself. So the women actually playing the game, women actually participating in the game. So yeah, transitioning to more like questions about your take on your past journey. What would be the key lesson that you'd like to point to the audience that you've learned that knowing now you would basically integrate into the past version of yourself and making sure that you do something different? What would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, in retrospect, as I mentioned earlier, some of the projects, my early projects in football, or maybe some of my early time in Denmark, I think I definitely made some mistakes and didn't necessarily have the kind of well-rounded, maybe understanding of the intricacies between North American sport and European football. I talk about it a lot now, obviously, and I talk about it with clients a lot, but I think at the beginning, I probably didn't have as strong of an appreciation as I should have in terms of understanding how difficult this environment is, how difficult it is to make it a real successful business, how forward facing these clubs are in terms of decisions you make. They're in, if I buy a manufacturing company and make difficult decisions or controversial decisions or say things that I shouldn't say, no one cares. If you do that at a football club, it's on it's on the, local news, it's on social media, like people protesting at your matches. So understanding how forward facing this industry is, I think is really important. So yeah, I mean, I wish in retrospect I had someone who would have come to me and said, hey, this is kind of what you could expect. These are the things to look out for. But that when I got into European football 8 to 10 years ago, there were very, very few Americans in the space. And the ones that were in the space were just kind of doing different things or had come in and come out. And so now it's so common that it's a little bit easier to kind of inform and let folks know what to expect. But at the time, I didn't have that. And I wish I did have that in retrospect.
Yeah, it's a good point that you make. But when we look at what's currently going on right now, or has been going on for a while now, we are basically living in a time where American capital is dominating European football across the different leagues, from the English league to the Italian league. What would you say? Would you hope for in terms of like the lasting impact that you like to see from the American capitalist or private equity firms to have as a sort of like a like a legacy that we can look back on and say this era was a positive for not just the returns for the investors or the owners of that firm, but also the actual football industry stakeholders, the clubs, the players, the society itself.
I hope that the influx of American capital can help build structures in place at these clubs and these leagues that promote financial sustainability. So many clubs lose money. There's a perception, which in some ways is reality, that the joke is, if you're a billionaire and you invest in a football club, you become a millionaire. That joke, like sometimes that's true, right? A lot of these clubs lose a lot of money, and that's not okay. And that's not an ecosystem that I want to be a part of. That needs to change. We need to change. We need to figure out how to get our costs under control. The financial modeling in European football is broken, just really is. And my hope is that more American sophisticated capital can come in and help change that. I don't know too many Americans in particular who enjoy losing money. So the hope is that structures can change, more financial discipline can come in. That's what I spend a lot of time on. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. There's plenty of American groups that make the same financially imprudent decisions that other groups make, but I think generally speaking, there is a desire over the long run to try to change that system, and hopefully I can be a small part of that.
Great. And then the last question before we transition to a quick fire round. For young professionals probably listening to this or watching this, what would be your advice to them in terms of not following the path that you've taken? Obviously, everyone's path is unique, and you can't replicate someone else's path even if you try. But what would be your advice to them in terms of developing the right skills, the right mindset, the right sort of like viewpoint on how to approach penetrating and having a lasting impact in this industry?
Yeah, so I think, number one, it's figuring out what is your unique skill set that is different from other people. The amount of young folks that come through the door that are like, hey, Jordan, I want to go run social media at a football club. And like, everyone wants to do that. It's fun, it's sexy, right? But what I need at a football club is people that can help me sell tickets, that can drive revenue, right? Maybe people that have a really unique and creative way of looking at and building data infrastructure, right? I need unique skill sets that maybe other people don't have. So it's figuring out how does that intersect as a young person with what you want to do, right? Obviously, sport is a passion. You want to figure out things that give you enjoyment. So figuring out what that looks like, I think is really important, number one. And number two is getting real world experience. And that could be internships, that can be entry level jobs or whatnot. But like getting behind the scenes at a football club is really important. Proving yourself to upper management, to people who work at clubs that you are motivated and you can help add value to the organization is really important. So it's a tough industry. You know, you're not going to make a lot of money. It's in long hours, but it's something that's really, it's most people are really passionate about. And it's something that I think can be really beneficial for most folks if they understand what they're, what they need to do to kind of get into it.
Yeah, that's very solid advice, and I hope young professionals or young people listening to that, so watching it, take it and implement it. So, just a few questions to basically, get a deeper perspective into how you think and who you are as a person. The first question I'll ask you is basically, what football executive do you admire or have you admired, and why?
Paul Barber at Brighton. I think the way Brighton has been run has been incredible. And obviously that starts at the top with Tony Bloom, but Paul is, I've actually never met him personally, but following his career, the way that club's run, how financially profitable they've been, how they've had success on the pitch, how they've turned into just this machine of selling players. It's about as well run a football club as I think I've ever seen. And for me, that's something that I try to replicate in a lot of my projects.
Right. Yeah. Just to caveat a little bit, we have Paul Barber on the show in a few weeks, so
Oh, good. There you go.
I'll be glad to tell him what you said about him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the second question I'll ask you is, what is more important, sporting director or great CEO?
Good question. I would say great CEO, only because I think CEO is the one that works closely with the board and is kind of really setting long-term strategy as an organization. Obviously, having a sporting director who does that on the football side is important. But as an owner, I need my person on the ground who's going to implement my vision, my board's vision. And the CEO really is the person that can do that, probably a little bit more so than the sporting director. But I mean, you really need both, right? The sporting director is the CEO of the football side, right? So it's like you really kind of need both, but I guess the CEO is the one I would probably have to pick.
Okay, it's a good choice. And then the final one I would say is beyond your experience, what book or resource would you say is shaped your worldview, the knowledge that you have, and has brought you to where you are today?
What book or resources? That's a good question, I think. I mean, honestly, most of the things that I've learned have been on the ground experience. I think this is an industry where, there are things you can read out there about the football industry or football finance, and there's books out there. I know plenty of people I've written chapters in books. But I think the real benefit that you can get is just on the ground experience. There's no book that's going to tell you how to run a football club. I think I speak to a lot of young people and they're doing their master's thesis on an academic paper on football ownership or multi-club ownership or whatnot. And I think it's great, but like a lot of that is very conceptual. Like the football industry is real, tangible, face to face. And so there's nothing that I think I've ever learned in a book that is any better than what I did being behind the curtain at a football club. So I think if I was giving someone advice, like I said earlier, it's like, sure, you can read all the books in the world, but go do an internship for a summer at a football club and you'll get vastly more knowledge than you ever would in a book. So that's just the way I look at it.
Yeah, this is true. And this is consistent in every industry you go to. Practical knowledge beats theory. Thank
Yes.
you. So yeah, Jordan, this has been an outstanding conversation. You gave us very rare, insightful viewpoints into the challenges, opportunities of running a football club from a boardroom specifically. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So if you've enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe and share. And a massive thank you to Jordan again for joining us and wishing you continued success in shaping the future of the game. Thank you and goodbye.